Hey, I'm Leila. Welcome back. Thank you so much for tuning in every week to see my new videos. And thanks so much to everyone who is sharing my videos with their friends and on social media. It means so much to me knowing that I can bring more creativity into people's lives every day. So I have decided that it's time to bring a little bit of painting into the mix. And today we're going to look at watercolor media. It will be just a basic tutorial where we will be looking at some water mixable materials like watercolor, watercolor paper, watercolor brushes, water mixable pastels, watercolor pencils, and few other little tips and tricks. So today let's start by talking about watercolor, about the material itself. Now, when you go to the shop, you see a big variety of not only different brands, but also each brand offers different type of material, that you can use. So, for example, you can get a watercolor set like this. You can see this is an old one, where you've got watercolor already placed in the palette. So you don't need to squeeze anything out, worry about it getting anywhere, something nice and compact like this. Or you can get watercolor like this. This is actually a brand new paint set, so I just got it for this tutorial. So where you've got your tubes that you just, and then you've got the paint. Now, the good thing about this is that usually if you count out how much paint you've got by mils compared to something like this, usually it works out a little bit cheaper. Not always, you can do your own maths, but the downside to something like this is that you have to have a separate palette. There are as well different palettes that you can get, but something like this is quite common, where you can just squeeze a little bit of paint on there and just leave it. Now, for those of you who are completely new to watercolor, you need to know the fact that even when watercolor dries, as soon as you add water to it, it runs again. So, for example, unlike oil paint or acrylic paint, as soon as you add water, it runs again. So even though it's dry, it never is really dry. That's why things like that work, where you can just add some water. And it gives you color, right? So palettes like this are quite good because you can squeeze out all your different colors that you'd like to have on your palette, and when you're finished working with it, you can just close it, and then next time you need to work, you are not wasting any paint. Some people use plates and things like that for palettes, but if you have to wash it after every time you finished painting, you are throwing your paint away. So for example, if I use half of this on my work, then I have to wash it out and it just pretty much goes to waste. That's why having a separate palette for just watercolor paint is very useful, because then you don't waste paint, and sometimes you can even pre-mix your own mixes, and that can work really well. Now, this is another way of doing it. I have this set, and all of this paint, see, I just keep refilling it. So in the first place, it was a set like this, which has pretty much run out because I've used out all of the paint, and then I just get paint in tubes, squeeze it in there, and that's good to go. Again, even though it's dry, because watercolor never dries, it's really cool to not actually have to worry about it, putting glad wrap over it or spraying it with water, whatever you would do, say, with acrylics, for instance. With this, you can just add water and it runs again. I will also do a separate video on different watercolor techniques as well, so make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss that one. Watercolor is one of the handiest materials to take with you when you're traveling, especially if you love doing plein air painting or sketching on the spot. Because it dries so quickly, and unlike oils or even acrylics, you don't need to wait for your artwork to dry to be able to put it away. Also, because it's so compact, you know, you've got your little watercolor set and you've got a pad with watercolor paper. That way you can just take it with you, sketch, put it back in your backpack, and you're good to go. Okay, so in this set for traveling, I've got masking tape, I've got my paint set that has palette built in, and it has all the colors that I need, so anytime that I want to stop over and sketch something, I've got pretty much everything I need in here. Now I've got my different sized brushes, a few sketching pencils, I've got a little bottle with water that doesn't leak, and a piece of cloth, so you can have, of course, you know, your tissues or paper towels and things like that. So that way it's very easy. All I need to do is just grab, you know, a painting sketching pad with me and this little bundle, and I'm pretty much good to go. Sometimes you would come across a really beautiful scenic view and you think, oh, I really want to take all of that in, I really want to capture that, and so having a set like that is perfect. And now let's have a look at my personal favorite water mixable material. It's water mixable pastels, or sometimes called watercolor pastels. I personally absolutely love watercolor pastels. They are so great because you can get them in a set, you can get them in different colors. Some companies even sell separate colors, you know, separately, and some sell them as sets, you know, of your usual 12 colors, 24 colors, and so on. So they're very, very handy. Now the cool thing about these is that they are water mixable, but they can be used as normal pastels as well. So for example, if you are traveling and you one of those people like me that just loves to stop, if you see a beautiful view, you just have to stop and sketch it, you know. So this is perfect because you can work dry or you can add water. I'll show you here, and it turns into paint. Very similar to watercolor pencils, but they just have a little bit more to give, you know, but more of an intensity. You can work very fast with them. There are also amazing techniques and different ways on how to use these. And heads up to my lovely patrons on Patreon, I have made a special video for you guys that will go over using water mixable pastels in more detail. I will post it very soon, and for those of you who are not following me there, if you're interested, please go in and have a look. You might find a lot of new videos that you haven't seen before. And of course, many of you know about watercolor pencils by now. So it's a colored pencil. Which again you can use as a pencil. And then you can always add water. And you create that extra depth and color. You can use your brush half dry by using a paper towel, for example, and just removing some of the water from the brush and then softly blending the colors out. Again, I will do tutorials on this in detail, on the actual techniques on how to use things, how to blend things a little bit later, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. Now, these are all different materials, you know, but they're all from the same family, so they are perfect for mixing together. For example, you might create a painting with watercolor, and you might want to add extra definition with pastels and even pencils. And the cool thing is that the thing that ties them all up together is that they can always be blended in together if you need them to, or there's nothing wrong with just leaving things as they are. Okay, so as I said, please stay tuned, because I will be doing more tutorials on techniques and different ways and different tricks as well. And some of these tricks, maybe you haven't even heard about them. So different materials and household items that you can use with your watercolor materials to create these amazing, really cool effects. Now let's talk about brushes. Okay, brushes for watercolor traditionally meant to be very soft, natural bristles, so something like squirrel. But these days, because you have so many beautiful synthetic brushes that are just perfect copies of the natural bristle, then you can use those as well. And again, because there are so many different ways of using watercolor, you can use different brushes. As I said previously, I will be making another video. But for now, just as an overview of what you would need as your basics, is that you would need different sized brushes. Now you would want something quite large and something that can hold a lot of water for things like large washes, especially if you want to work on something reasonably large, where you want to add a lot of moisture to your paper, for example, before you start painting. You can use these brushes, and then you can cover a large area with water, for example, to apply, you know, your washes or whatever it is that you'd want, if you want your paint to run. So these are large, soft brushes, something that holds a lot of water. And just to demonstrate how much water it can hold, see, if I squeeze it out, I'm actually squeezing out a whole lot of it out. So you want something like this. Then you also might want to have a soft, flat brush as well. So this is very similar. So this is like a soft sort of a bristle as well, and something very similar, but this paintbrush can be used very comfortably for painting, and also because it's flat, you can use it for other kind of effects as well, you know, just to create different texture, different shape. So something like a flat, nice flat, soft brush also can be quite useful. Also, if you noticed, I have different sized brushes, so brushes that are a little bit bigger and they're a little bit smaller, because depending on how large the area that you are working on, that's how large your brush should be. So if you're going for little details, you would want to use a smaller brush with a really fine point. But if you are trying to have your, I don't know, A2 sized piece of paper wet very quickly, then you need to use something like this. In fact, I know, and I've used it as well when I was a student, if big brushes, big soft brushes were very expensive, you could actually use a piece of rug that you can dip in the water and then just go over the whole thing very quickly to prep everything for painting. Now you also might like to use smaller brushes. So this is a squirrel brush as well, and you've got really fine, perfect point. Also, brushes like this are quite good because you see that part there, this is where it holds a lot of paint and a lot of moisture. And you know, as you know, watercolor is pretty much colored water, so you want this to be holding up a lot of water. And of course, you would want a really tiny brush, especially if you're like me, and sometimes I love to work very sketchy with watercolor, but sometimes I love to do almost miniature style sort of artworks. And of course, having a really fine, perfect tip on your round brush is very important. So I'm just lifting up some paint from there, and you can create very fine lines, marks, whatever it is that you're doing. So depending on your style, of course, and even if you don't go into details, it's always helpful to have at least one really tiny little brush. Now, brushes that are square, flat brushes, whatever you want to call them. They are useful for one type of mark making. Also, the cool thing about these is even when they're not very large, because they're so flat, you can cover a large area quite quickly. They will run out of water quite quickly as well. So see how thick this brush is? So it can hold a lot of water. But you have less control, because when there's too much water, it's much harder to get into specific things. And with something like this, say for example, if you don't have any of these brushes but you've got something like that, you can still use it. You're just going to need to have to go in and constantly back into the water bottle. Now it's time to talk about the paper, because not only is the material that's very important, but also what you apply it on is also just as important and will create a completely different look depending on what you will choose. A watercolor paper, it's probably the easiest to find. Any art store, even stationery stores, would have folders, would have different like sketching pads of different size that you would be able to find. But it's also good to be able to understand the difference between some of the materials. Like for example, I've got these different samples of different papers here, and I will tell you a little bit about them. I've got this usual sort of very thin sketch paper, so this is more like printer paper, which is just 80 grams. So remember my video where I was telling you about drawing materials? The difference in thickness of the paper is shown in the weight of the paper. So when you see that it says it's 210 grams, it's a specific thickness. Now if you see that it's 300 grams, it's thicker. So this is 80-gram paper, and I'll show you why you should not be using it for watercolor. Now because it's so thin and it's not really designed to withstand a lot of water, it could be good for like a light preliminary sketch or to work something out. But as soon as I apply water, and remember watercolor is colored water, it starts to absorb, buckle. You see it's already changing its shape. And I'm not even applying that much water. I'm not applying tons of water, you know, like sometimes you would wet and you would stretch your paper, and there are other techniques. But see, if I turn it over on the other side, you can see how it's soaking through, which means that if 2 minutes later I need to go in and do something, I can literally just, you know, look, see that's made a hole there. And also it changes shape, so it becomes really wobbly, and so you can see how it's really not suitable for anything to do with applying water on it. So that's why you should not be using paper that is not designed to hold water. It doesn't even have to be watercolor paper. It can be printmaking paper, but it has to be designed to hold water. Now, my next piece of paper that I'm going to show you is this one. And this is 200 grams paper. Now, you can also see that a lot of watercolor paper would have texture on it. Some papers are more smooth, some are much more textured. So when you are choosing something, the best rule would be, if you are going for something very washy, very vague, very soft, maybe you want for that natural texture of the paper to show through, go for something very grainy. If you are wanting to get very detailed things, and you know, you want sharp edges, you want sharp lines, you would probably enjoy working on the paper that doesn't have that much texture on it. That's, you know, something smoother. So this paper, for watercolor paper, I'd say it's pretty smooth. It does have some texture on it, but it's not, you know, it's nothing that would stop you from getting into the detail if you wanted to. So I will show you how this one works. Something like this would hold water quite well. And you see how it's not getting into these little prickly things, and it's not showing up. It's not, see, with this amount of water, this paper hasn't been stretched. There's a technique for stretching paper. If I will be talking about it, it's a separate video on that. So with this paper, you can see how it's absorbing the water without buckling, without changing its shape. If I applied a lot of water on this paper, it will sort of bubble a bit and buckle a bit. But with this amount, it's holding it quite well, and it's just 200 grams. So It's thick, but it's not that thick. So see, if I'm applying, you know, a specific amount of pressure, it's sort of moving along. Now I've got another piece of paper here, and that's a sample of a 300 grams paper. Just the thickness that's different. And see already, if I'm trying to bug, I have to put so much more pressure in because it is so much thicker. And if I would like to work with a lot of moisture in there, I might like to create lots of big washers, you know, have this paper absorb a lot of water, then this is the paper that I would want to go for, not the thinner type. So here, what happens here? And you see how it takes a lot of water without any problems. I'm holding my hand on the other side. I can't even feel the dampness on the other side, and that's because it's so thick that it holds it really well. So you can create whatever you want on something like this without having to worry that it's going to ruin the paper or that you are over applying water. Obviously, having thicker paper is better for watercolor, but do pay attention to the texture, you know, because texture is something that would definitely impact the final look of your artwork. Here I've got something very different. Now this is 210 grams, so it's a little bit thicker than this, but thinner than this, but it's a different type of paper. Now, you know how I showed you that with watercolor you can use pencils, watercolor pencils, you can use pastels, you can use paint, you know, all of these things mixed up. And a lot of people like to do mixed media also involving, say, for example, ink pens and pencil drawings, you know, with watercolor. And this paper is called draw and wash. Sometimes you can see them as called drawing and painting paper, or wet and dry sketching paper. Different brands would call them differently, but whatever they would call it, you would be able to see that it's actually designed for drawing and for painting at the same time. Now this paper is very smooth, and it can be beautiful for creating drawings, but because it's so thick and so nice, like a really nice thick card, it can handle quite a bit of water as well. The only thing is, because it is so smooth, you see how I'm getting a very sharp edge there. So you can the good thing, of course, is that you can get a lot of detail in with this, and the bad thing is that, you know, in the process, as the paint dries, you're more likely to be left with lines, and makes it a little bit harder to blend. So for example, if we compare it to this, see how easy it is to blend, and with this, you know, it leaves more of the sharper line, which can be absolutely beautiful as well if this is part of your technique, you know, if this is what you rely on to create, for example, these overlapping areas. Right, so I will show you some examples of actually my sketches. Most of the time that I do watercolor nowadays is when I go somewhere, for example, like on a trip or something like this. So these ones are done on this draw and wash type of paper that I just showed you before, and you can see how they're quite small, so a lot of detail, very sharp edges that I wanted to create in this particular you know, these little squares. So this paper was perfect because I could get away with just using a tiny little brush and putting all the shadows and things through. But if you want something more blended, then a different kind of paper that has more texture will be much more suitable. When you finished your artwork, you might decide that you'd like to protect it from water and other elements. So I would suggest to go into an art shop and have a look at some spray varnishes. Just make sure that they are specifically designed for watercolor and to also to go onto paper. Otherwise, you might run into some problems. And always make sure that you apply varnish on 100% dry artwork. Hope you liked this basic introduction watercolor tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe and press the notification bell, because soon I will be making more tutorials that will cover watercolor painting techniques from basic to advanced. So it will be very helpful if this is something that you feel that you'd like to get into. Hope you have a lovely day, and thank you for painting with me.